Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show. Me, Tim Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss the origins of privilege, why left libertarians fail. Tim.
Today's topic / conversation is written somewhat in response to former guest Sean Gabb, who wrote an article, and it's somewhat he's just playing devil's advocate, although somewhat I think he agrees with it. It's talking about Kevin Carson's theory of left libertarianism, and today I'm going to argue why I think the left I would more so than think I know the left libertarians fail, someone also wrote a response to it and will fail, or they're just leftists. So I'm going to start with a sports example. Why am I not a star runner or basketball player? I think if you ask a left libertarian this question, they would say it is because of IP regulations, the schooling system, nutrition, or other regulations. And I think that is basically demonstratively false. It could be the case that I'm not a star basketball player because I don't live in a city-state that has lots of different competitions and stuff like that. Like in the American context, some people say certain areas get a lot of baseball players or college football players because, well, they're close to it and they're exposed to that. So maybe if one city focused on it, like the Dominican Republic has lots of baseball players because they basically, get raised playing that. But that's an obscure example here. I'm using sports examples to start this because in our can a society exist without elites? I started there. I did that with Keith Preston. Keith Preston is somewhat of a left libertarian. It seems like elite basketball players exist, and some elite basketball players and other elite athletes will state things like it's 90% genetic. It's not just about hard work. It's not just hard work doesn't matter, but it's 90%. It's 90% hard work. So I think libertarians, and particularly left libertarians like Carson and those who follow him like Sean Gabb, who do the same thing regarding other forms of ability, are making a mistake of magnitude. If you think about pursuing other talents, not just sports, there's an obvious parallel in there. And this is where I think left libertarians fail. To say everything is about IP or regulations or things like that, again, I think it's just an error of magnitude here. You could argue that the real problem is society's values. And this is where we get into sort of deep philosophy regarding people like Nietzsche and Christianity and other writers. I mean, you could say, well, the problem is we have the wrong values. And this is always a thing that we're always going to be chasing here. Even really good writers, scribes, etc., have power in the long run. They don't have the immediate earthly trappings of power, but obviously people like Adorno, Marcuse, Socrates, Shakespeare, Orwell's, and others clearly are intelligent. They don't just come straight out of the woodshed, so to speak. And even if they do, they're somewhat genetic freaks too, in the same way with a sporting example here too. Or they're freaks of their just happen to be in the right environment at the right time. And that's another strain I think that should be discussed is luck. If you want to talk about the wealth of nations, you could just say that certain societies got wealthy just because they happened to, not necessarily a correct reason. And once you have first mover advantage, they happen to break away. So like this. If you don't take the conspiracy theory about the origins of Facebook, that is started by the CIA, lots of people had computer companies in the early 2000s, and it just happened to be one that made it, and everyone else failed. So that's another argument. I think the Hayekians would make that argument too. But I think the real issue here is regarding inequality. And where does it come from? Where does privilege come from? Left libertarians, I think, assume a priori equality. I think that is demonstrably false to assume a priori equality. And if you assume that, and then you see inequality in the world, you have to go back to your a priori theory of libertarianism or society in general. And when you find it, then you'll just insert the reasons why you think people fail. Now, it is the case that if you got rid of regulations, I think certain amounts of things would go away. But I think one of the things the left libertarians miss is that if you also get rid of regulations and the state, some forms of subsidies would also go away too. So in a free market, if you got, for example, like it's obviously that it's obvious to me that like if you assume automation and things like that, the Teamsters union probably would go away because you get automated truck drivers and automated other like secretaries and things like that. So that there's certain examples, and we're going to play the counterfactual game, which is what left libertarians functionally do. There's certain ways in which, well, if you imagine a different society, then they might not, their subsidized job might also not exist. So like, be careful with playing counterfactuals here. But I think the point, going back to where does inequality come from, is basically it's genetic. And you could say, well, life's unfair. And it's like, well, that's true. But I don't see how you get around that. And also, someone asked Hans Hoppe this question once at the PFS and the Council of Boogeyman. If and this shows up in the schooling system, if you really want to get outcome equality, if you have 5 people randomly selected throughout the world, and let's say they all speak English, one from India, one from Australia, one from Argentina, they come from different social backgrounds. If you want them all to have the same math score, the one with the lowest ability is you're going to have to put a lot of effort in. If you just assume equality, which is what the a priori equality, then you're actually going to the people who have the natural ability will do the best on that thing. So like if you're and you can sort of see this in families, because families drink the same water, families have the same parents, same house, same zip code. So a lot of things are controlled for, but different brothers will have, or different sisters will have different outcomes in terms of math ability or science, or music, so to speak. So that's my broad attack on left libertarians. So I think they're very good. I think they're very interesting. I love Kevin Carson's organization theory. I like the Libertarian Alliance. But I think it's an error of magnitude. That's my starting points with them. What do you make of this? What do you make of my critique?
Well, I think that's obviously true. That people are different. I mean, with kids, it's obvious. I mean, I've got 4, and they're all obviously very different. Even though functionally, are you going to be able to get a better natural experiment of keeping all the factors constant? Well, no, probably not. So it's clear that makes a huge difference. You're not a basketball player because, well, you're not tall enough, and etc. That's obviously true. So I suppose the question I have though is then, I do think that inequality is inevitable. The question that rises: how much inequality are you likely to get in a freed market, if you want to use the LL term? And why is it the case? So and you use the word privilege at one point, and rather than, I can't remember exactly how you used it, but when you use privilege, are you meaning legal privilege when you say privilege, or just mean that their outcomes are going to be better than other people? So yeah, it's a couple of things. It's how much inequality do you expect in the freed market, and secondly, what did you mean by privilege, and did you mean legal privilege, and if so, how do you think that relates to natural inequality?
Well, I will start with legal privilege, and because I think that's where left libertarians and right libertarians would agree the most. So why do some groups or individuals get legal privilege to begin with? I think that's the question you have to ask. That needs to be answered, because I think part of the right libertarian, or the rightists in general, and this dates back to the French Revolution, is how do you get towards your better society, if not utopia? So like in our current existing world, we obviously have legally privileged people. Like the president of the United States, or any government in general, is to some extent has sovereign immunity. Police officers, militaries, and so forth all throughout the world have quote unquote sovereign immunity to some immunity there are examples of people go, Derek Chauvin, but in general, the state, and this goes back to Hans Hoppe's class theory, in which what Marx gets right, or the Austrian and Marxist class theory. I think that's a technical title that you can search on Mises. It's available free. He also did a lecture for, which is, well, obviously the state is privileged, and subsequently state corporations or corporations that go with the state to some extent are privileged too. I mean, we saw that in COVID. COVID lockdowns benefited Amazon much more than it benefited brick and mortar stores because, well, people could just, hit click from their homes and so forth. It benefited Netflix because people had a captive audience, didn't benefit movie theaters. I'm using COVID examples to piss off the left libertarians, who some of them went along with COVID lockdowns. So that's just an example of many. You could talk about wars and so forth, obviously. That's a big example too. But you have to ask the question, why does Jeff Bezos get himself in that position and so forth? Why does certain people become kings and other people don't? And if that is the case, how do you get there, so to speak? How do you get to a world where people don't have legal privilege? Well, I would say you have to abolish the state. Now, this is where anarchist libertarians and left libertarians are all utopians to some degree, because anyone who thinks about states would say, well, abolishing the state is utopian. You're just going to have private warlords and gangs take over. That's the general thing. Well, which to me it sounds weird, because what you're really saying is that's already the case. What you're really saying is the current existing society. It's just that Donald Trump's the main gangster, or Joe Biden, or Jeffrey Epstein, or Mossad is the main gangster. And if you read histories like The Devil's Chessboard or Whitney Webb, then it's become even more true. But the question is, why did Alan Dulles or whoever statist corporate monster you want to point to become who they are? Let's just go quick history of everyone's favorite, Donald Trump. His father, Fred Trump, gave him, today it's like a couple $100 million, but whatever, it was like $1 million to start his business. How did he acquire those connections in New York City? Well, he had, they're a Catholic sort of, I'm going to get the precise, I like it some of the, they're a Catholic, like Irish-ish, like Italian-like type background. I forget the exact ethnicity, and they had dealing with various Jews and various gangsters and various politicians and so forth. And he was so much shrewd. He was good at networking. This is Fred Trump. So that's how the patriarch Trump, and same way with the patriarch Kennedy, Jack and RFK's father, built their network. Now you could say, well, that's immoral, and this goes back to values. But the question is, like, if there are legally privileged people, how do they get there? How do they get their legal privilege? How do Elon Musk or Elon Musk's, gold mine diamond Dutch father get his gold mine? And again, if the left libertarians will say, well, this is from plunder and we need reparations, yet the current existing state is what you say it is, why would the current existing state, change its ways, so to speak? And how would you maintain that too? So that's my first response to legal privilege, which I think is the example that both left libertarians and right libertarians would say is bad. Well, what's the origins of that? You have to push it back a generation or two, but then you have to ask that question: why did that happen in the first place? What would you make to that, Swithin?
Oh, I entirely agree with that. I mean, to get yourself to be an integral part, whoever is an integral part of the ruling class in any sophisticated or relatively sophisticated society is going to have to demonstrate intelligence and generally sort of highly competent character traits to be able to function well in that society. If you have a primitive society, then yes, you could probably just overwhelm your opposition by brute force, and so the strongest would win. And that's not necessarily correlated with intelligence or any other sort of administrative competency. But once you get to a society of this particular size, you need to marshal a lot of men. You have to organize them so that you can then defeat the enemy, and that requires skill. So anybody who is, that's just, I suppose, it's war, but at least minimally with this, the war and the state are really inevitably intertwined. You're going to have to be very good at sort of doing that. And then also, if you similarly, if you take Hopper's sort of theoretical reconstruction of the state, where the state begins when an individual who was respecting the community arbitrates disputes, then decides, well, you know what? Yeah, you came to me because you thought I was good, but now you can only come to me and you can't go anywhere else. Otherwise, I'm going to bash your head in. Clearly that guy is going to be competent. Now, obviously, as the ruling class grows, you're going to get functionaries who are effectively not very well functioning. And there are beneficiaries of the state who aren't really part of the ruling class, who get privileges, but not because they're particularly competent. So, I mean, the welfare queen would be a good example of that. But yeah, if you're talking about the big players who you think are genuine part of the ruling class, reasonably in a relatively broad definition, Jeff Bezos includes that, certainly Elon Musk, etc. They are competent individuals. Are they moral or whatever? It's irrelevant. The point is, can they do stuff that other people can't do? And do they demonstrate aptitudes and intelligence? To which the answer is, well, clearly yes. So, which in a way, this ties into elite theory. Why do certain people rule over other people? Well, because they become organized, and part of organization is intelligence. So essentially, in certain respects, the better people rule, because otherwise someone else would replace them. So, because I relates this, I thought, well, if you really wanted to bring about the ideal society, what you really need to do to somehow convince whoever would end up being the ruling class, or who could replace the current ruling class, an elite who could, high up and could circulate in sort of the Paretoian sense. You have to explain. You have to convince somebody who's in their interest to do this. Either it would be financial or prestige, or moral or spiritual. That would be really how you'd end up with the ideal society, because otherwise those who have the levers of power will use it and exploit it to their own advantage. So yeah, I would entirely agree with you on the origins of the privilege stuff.
Well, thanks. I mean, the elite theory is more depressing to certain more broadly left libertarians than the alternatives to elite theory. But I think on a descriptive level, elite theory is the most probable or the most likely, sort of version of sort of mass, like sociology, so to speak, of society. I'd say the best critique of elite theory would just say, well, the elites have bad values, which is another place where left libertarians are kind of LARPing Christians without knowing, or some of them are outright Christian and so forth. If you read Tom Holland or any sort of theorists too, like you could just say, well, Fred Trump or, Jeff Bezos' father are just pursuing the wrong things. What you really want to pursue is intellectual prestige or a quiet life of prayer or helping, the poor and so forth. And so, and I think that has the best point. This is like the Nietzschean transvaluation of values, which in the Christian sense is you want to make them more, well, to the Nietzsche, you want to make them more slave-like. And for the non-Christian, for the Nietzschean, you want to make it more, or depending on which one, you want to make it more Marxist-like. You have Marxist Nietzscheans too. But like, this is the point where I think you talk about like why they'll make it more prestigious or so and stuff like that. I think that is their ultimate strength. But then the question is, why do you want to get power in the first place? If becoming part, maybe you don't need to film yourself in, like have Jeffrey Epstein film yourself, having sex with a child to become part of the elite. Maybe that's not that bad, or do some sort of satanic cult thing. Although, I don't know, after you read enough Whitney Webb and Peter Sloterdijk, who wrote Devil's Chef, I just recently read this after the JFK files release, you have to wonder, what do they have on these people? What do they have on these people? They're clearly to some extent the political and economic figures. There's some method of control out there. And it didn't start 5 years ago or either. you have to wonder like what, no, but like even if this is a high X point, why the worst get on top? Maybe it's not that bad, but even if you want to start like at a restaurant, a relatively innocuous business, I mean, there might be other restaurants in town. If your restaurant does well, you might take away customers from that restaurant. That's just, if there's only a set amount of money, obviously you're going to take money away from that. I mean, even quote unquote charity, so to speak. If you do charity, like, which is not a business endeavor, it's not done for quote unquote profit, and there's other churches or other charitable organizations. If your charity becomes more successful than their charity, their charity are going to have less people that they can claim they helped. And now again, maybe that's not the prestige isn't about amount of people helped, but it is an implicit thing built in. This is why, even though you might say Ayn Rand has terrible politics and so forth, I do think Ayn Rand and Nietzsche and these people make a point about like individualism and so forth. That would be my like response towards left libertarians here. Like they might be playing the 500-year long game since the Enlightenment, or whatever 2,000-year long game on changing the values of society. But as many people complain in the Marxist camp, the working class in general just wants higher wages and to buy more consumer goods. They want to live like Trump. Not all of them, but a lot of them just want to live like Trump, or they want to live the life of, or they want to take nice vacations and so forth. They aren't the aesthetic scribes and, moral aggrandizers that they want them to be, so to speak. Which worries is why I think Marxism which I think left libertarians by admission draw from, quote unquote, fails. It's not just because Trotsky or Bukharin didn't take power, or they didn't focus on this thing. I mean, I just think there's a certain selfish individualism that you can get into what is selfishness that just sort of why the worst get on top. So I'm a libertarian, but I'm a pessimistic libertarian. Which if I listen to Slavoj Zizek, one of the benefits of pessimism, if something good happens, if something good happens, you're happy. You didn't expect it. So a certain degree of pessimism. If you want to be happy, be a pessimist, and then if anything good happens, it's great. So like when leaders in the power elite operate on our own interests, he's like, wow, why did that happen? Well, I would go back to, I think your point was key in the sense that how do you convince the power elite, if there's going to be a power elite and you can't abolish the power elite, to have the quote unquote people's interests? And that to me is the question, which I don't think is an easy answer. But one answer is, well, if the plebs and people are productive, well, then they can't be eliminated as easily. That's a starting point. But that's, now we're getting to somewhat different territory. What do you make of my response there, Swithin, regarding the value question here? Because I think Kevin Carson will just say Trump is a gangster. Jeff Bezos is a gangster, and various other people. Andrew Carnegie is a gangster. Gangsters are bad people. And he might be correct. He probably is. But then, like, obviously, but gangsters have a certain skill, and that's where I say left libertarians start to LARP Christians in my regard. What would you make of that, Swithin?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say the gangster, but I mean, I think it's just Keith at one point. It's I think he was talking about conspiracies and whether they work or not, and I'm like, well, maybe we don't know about them because they're so good at pulling them off. Maybe the lower level sort of actual people who are considered in the news. Oh yes, gang leader X, gang leader Pedro Gonzalez. Don't sue me, Pedro Gonzalez. I don't know if it is, the Mexican drug cartel, whatever. He's done X, Y, or Z. And he's been found out for corruption or something. So like American judges, and it's like, well, maybe he's not very good at. Maybe he's not as competent as the CIA or other organizations that can actually pull things off. So, yeah, I think you're exactly correct with that. I think the interesting thing with motivation, it could be that they want to buy lots of consumer goods Although when you get, I'm not rich enough, so it may well be the case. If I earn a few million a year, I'd be like, well, actually, I could get this if I earned this amount much money more. So maybe there are always more things to buy and more reason to have more money. But it would seem to me that one of the motivations of the power elite eventually is once they have enough money, now assuming that exists, I think their goal is power. And by power here, I mean they want to sort of remold society in their own image, or go down in history in some way. I don't think Jeff Bezos merely wants to be known as, although he might, the guy who just set up the world's best online shopping service. It seems like once you get beyond a certain level, it ends up being you want to use your wealth and influence to not just do what the public wants you to do, which is usually sell cheap books and deliver them quickly, but to remold their values. Now, of course, you could always say everybody wants to remold their values in certain respect. Why you're right, you'll do anything. But it seems to be the case that once you get to a certain level, the balance tips. Or it could be the case that they just want to have even greater social status. I mean, you could argue that the reason Donald Trump wanted to become president because he thought it would kind of be cool if he was president, because that would motivate him to do it. So I think that's, and that probably is the case. But as to what motivates people, it's something I'm thinking about because, the key is to change the motivations of the elite class, and then the question is, well, what motivates them? And then you need to work back from there. And it's probably would be a combination of money, power, pleasure, and prestige. The question is in what amounts, and which is the most important, and when, etc. So I think I agree with that. But back to inequality, because it seems to be the case that left libertarian holds a position that, absent the state, that even if we recognize that there are inherent differences, they'll try to relativize it. But I suppose they do admit, maybe IQ is 80% genetic or something like that. That, well, in reality, if we did have the free market, there'd be some inequality, but there wouldn't really be that much inequality. I'm guessing from the sound of it, you think that's false. So the question arises, how different do you think income and wealth distribution, so income being the flow of income you get and wealth being the value of your assets, how different do you think that would be in a freed market from the current market? I think, and then I suppose as well, do you think that the left libertarian, if he agreed with your analysis on what the freed market would look like, would he then cease to be a left libertarian and just become a socialist or some generic leftist?
Well, the hyper vulgar position would be that the income distribution would be worse than, in their terms, worse than it is already. And I do think there is potential reasons to say that. You can there is potential reason to say that. We did an episode on land acquisition, and I think it was titled Hans Hoppe, Crazy Horse, and I think we included a third person, because oftentimes left libertarians will start at the original sin of, let's say, like the Marxists, of and McIntyre does this too, and After Virtue as well, with the origins of when people acquired land. But if you take the Marxist theory seriously, and actually the Platypus Affiliated Society with Chris Catrone buys this too. I was listening to a 3-hour take on this, so if you want to do a land acknowledgement, this is what they said. If you want to do a land acknowledgement, you can do it in a land acknowledgement, but you have to list the 100 different tribes that contested that land. You can't just list one, because what you're doing is you're freezing the world as it was in 1500 or 1700. So, this goes back to our episode regarding land acknowledgement here, because that's their quote unquote original sin of original sins here. We'll say, well, you're not really balling John Locke and so forth. And it's well, we don't have a good theory of, we have a theory of land acquisition, so to speak, and about homesteading. But everyone knows that the initial origins of it is, quote unquote, dubious. And then we get into the classic civilizations questions about different uses of property and so forth and things like that. So, if we want to go back to the quote unquote starting point here, I just think that becomes an original sin problem. This is how do you get to the freed market here? And if you say some of the origins of inequality is based on these things, how do you undo them? Especially if the state today is what you say it is, run by gangsters like Trump or Biden or the Epsteins or, Keir Starmer or whoever. How do you get there, so to speak? How do you rectify that? Which is when people say, well, libertarians just want to have the same thing. They're just accepting the things. And it's like, well, how do you, this is where the Burkean stuff comes into Edmund Burke. I don't know how do you, and if you go back, if you take the Walter Block route, if you have a slave holder and a slave owner, what you're dealing with is a 10 generation problem, it's like 8 generations ago. And the right libertarians are right. In the past 70 to 80 years, this is the hyper vulgar position. There's been huge income transfers to, various groups throughout the United States too. Are we going to add those? Are we going to count those to, for example, all Indian reservations in the United States have casinos. Why do they have casinos? Well, because of the Protestants, casino gambling was largely illegal throughout the United States. Vegas was the first non-Indian place to change it. But there's a big casino in Indian land up in Connecticut, so to speak. Are they going to get their accounts, quote unquote, money taken away from their accounts because, well, they had a business privilege that not everyone else had? I assume lots of people would want to open casinos or could open casinos, but actually their casinos aren't even run by them sometimes. They're run by outside, mega corporations like the Adelsons would run their casino. They just have the rights. Talk about a weird hybrid business. So that's the hyper vulgar position. So some of the left libertarians, view, if you go back in the history and disputed history and do it accurately, you might get the quote unquote wrong answer, so to speak. And I think I don't like killing Palestinians either, and I don't like the United States spending money and weapons to Israel. But it is the case that the land there is quote unquote disputed, and then you get into the problem. Well, you have land claims from 2,000 years ago versus 600 years ago versus 60 years ago. And you could just freeze the current existing land. But I don't know how you're going to have a commission to start from that point. And then as far as regulations concerned, again, I think there is a way in which regulations works the other way. As Richard Spencer in that Boogeyman Council will point out, the black middle class in Washington, around Washington cities, does work a lot in the managerial state. So if you abolish the managerial state today, if you abolish, I think a disproportionate amount of blacks are in the military, in the police, and in various other organizations. So if you abolish the organizations that, and I'm just speaking in the American context, that Kevin Carson obviously wants to abolish, you might have a funny outcome. You might have the outcome that you're not supposed to have. I've been thinking about this topic for years, by the way. I came into the United States recently, and, it was the people who were working the counters of Border Patrol and Customs were very DEI. And I just chuckled to myself, I could not, what the heck is this? But that's who you could hire to staff this job too. I wouldn't really want to do that, even though I might think that it might have a purpose. So I do think regulations matter, by the way. I do think regulations matter, but they matter both ways too. So there's certain ways in which I think they quote unquote benefit and disbenefit. I sometimes ask you, because you work in the education sector, and I think you've admitted that. I won't get into details. Are you a benefit of the regime or a disbenefit of the regime? And I think for any person, if you're this is Michel Foucault's theory of power, it goes both ways. Power flows up, power flows down. There's certain ways which we benefit, and there's certain ways which we disbenefit from the regime. If you want to calculate all those out, it is clear that the past 100 years we've had a managerial state that, at least on the surface level, wants to quote unquote help the poor. Now, this gets weird too, because people like LBJ's Great Society, as Black conservatives will say, destroyed the Black family. But where do you put that into your debiting and crediting of the past? I don't know. And actually, if you look at the technical history of why crack cocaine got higher sentences or something like that, it was actually Black voters, many older Black voters wanted it, as pointed out. So, where do you put the responsibility for that? So, my solution is to say, well, we have a lot of reason to assume that people will just be as flawed and just be as smart in the freed market as the current market. That we could assume that the income distribution will be roughly the same. That's now they would say that's a vulgar position, but I would say that is my position here. I would be roughly the same. I don't think we have any reason to assume otherwise, and I do think some of the things. I mean, I actually think certain aspects of the progressive movement probably did, in some ways, reduce inequality, and in some ways, exacerbated it. That'd be my overall take of the last 150 years of economic history. And again, I don't know this perfectly, but that's my intuition, so to speak. I think I have some data to back that up. That'd be my case. What would you take of the case? You actually are more Kevin Carsonian than me in that regard.
I would agree with a lot of the things you said there. I mean, it's difficult to tell who benefits overall and by how much, etc. It's tricky to say to what extent I benefit or disbenefit from the current system, and to top that up is going to be very difficult. I do, though, think you would expect a more even income and certainly wealth distribution. Probably wealth more than income. And the reason is in the free market, if it was the case and you ended up in the free market with a hard money without any form of sort of collective central banking, which of course you wouldn't have central banking, but you have hard money, Bitcoin, gold or whatever, that I think would seriously and massively curtail wealth inequality to the extent that we have it today. Now, clearly wealth inequality existed historically because of different land holdings, and you're right that the land question really is the fundamental question, not to turn into a Georgist. But the reason why the asset owning class end up with substantially more wealth is because essentially you live in an inflationary environment, which increases the value of assets. And so anyone who has them, and they generally go up, means that anybody who has comparatively little, and even if they saved a bit, the only way for them to sort of get a rate of return is to whack it into things like the stock market and other things, because otherwise the real value of them will just be eroded by inflation. And then, of course, you've got people within who are direct beneficiaries of money creation, so the banking sector. So I suppose I would say the banking sector and the state, I think, well, state obviously by definition, and the current banking sector almost certainly are huge beneficiaries of the current system. And how as well, if you own assets, it's then much easier to get debt financing as well, because you own assets that the bank can take, and so it's much easier to get, and so you have much better access to credit. I mean, so for instance, if you look at the most indebted people in the world, they are the richest people in the world, which makes sense because they're the ones who are credit worthy enough to get that number of loans, because otherwise they won't get them. So I think the key thing to focus on here, which I think is pretty much a slam dunk, is the banking and financial system. And in a gold or a Bitcoin standard world, it's going to be the increase in sort of real value of assets is going to be much, much lower. It's going to be more useful for the poor because they will be able to just save. And in a price deflationary environment, assuming that's good and what would exist, which I think would, then you can basically save and your real value of things go up. Also, as well, there'd be much less of debt-based finance and probably more equity-based finance because of the relatively low real returns you would get in a deflationary environment. I mean, you could get some. Oh, and as an aside on that, as a complete aside, people may be interested. Bob Murphy recently did a Mises video explaining how you could make profits in a deflationary environment, which was interesting. Basically, his main point was this: if you buy up factors of production, so even if a bottle of wine goes down in price over over a year, like the first year and second year is cheaper than the second, all that matters is your inputs. Is that the price you sell the wine for in the second year is cheaper than is higher than the price you paid for the inputs in the first year. If so, you can make a margin, you can make a profit. So you can still, if people are listening thinking, oh no, you couldn't make profits in a deflationary environment, that's what happens. Year one, the factors of production you buy, you basically sell for in the second year for more than you purchased them for, which makes sense, and is still consistent with a price deflationary environment. As well, even if you only made a very small nominal amount, if there's price deflation, then in real terms it will go up. But just an aside, I thought people might find it interesting. But yeah, the money and banking system, I think, is key for massive change. Because I think as well, if you look historically, ever since the gold window was closed by Nixon in 71, wealth inequality rocketed thereafter. So it might be interesting to see relatively free societies without central banking and on some sort of hard money standard of some description, and see what the income inequality, wealth inequality was like at that point. So I think, yeah, that's a pretty much of a slam dunk. This
will be our area where we somewhat disagree. I would also say in the American context, like since the 70s, we've basically had domestic MMT. The politicians and the central bankers wouldn't call it that, and which essentially we did an episode a long time ago called Third Worldism and Cantillon effects. So this is again where I'd say like certain aspects of the United States, quote unquote, like Social Security. Like I think one of the reasons why the United States will, I think people like Tom Lewin go to large extent, right? Like some of the defenders of Social Security will say, well, as long as people keep buying U.S. Treasuries, United States money printer can just basically pump money, and yes, most of that money does not go to the quote unquote middle class or lower class, but some of it eventually does. So my claim here on the American context, and to a lesser extent, although I think it still matters to the British and European context, you have to ask, well, if you went to a straight Bitcoin gold standard, what, like now, if you're like me and you assume a priori inequality, then then like in a strange sense, Americans will be doing all right. The Europeans will be and British will be doing all right. If you assume they'll be doing different things, of course, and maybe more quote unquote productive things than either the services or running some shipping insurance, what is basically a scam. But they'll be doing different things to make money. But they'll still be making money, and they'll still be making a lot of it. And the same, if you look at like who was the great powers in 1960 or 1900, I mean, they weren't, they're the same countries, they're the same people groups. Or maybe they like change somewhat and so forth here. And there might be more new players too. But the old ones didn't entirely fall away. Otherwise, neocolonialism wouldn't, and Kevin Carson clearly will use terms like this, wouldn't quote unquote exist. I think the question here regarding interest in general, we did an episode also, is rent, interest, I think there's a third word. Well, is rent and interest slavery? And like, this is where, this goes back to what, people think it's a cartoonish example, but I think Walter Block's, and I know Walter, the Mises sort of have kicked him out for better or for worse, but I think the question is like, can you sell yourself into slavery? And like the question of interest, if interest is slavery, can you voluntarily sign a contract to give away more resources because of money time preference? Is that quote unquote slavery? And like if the terms of that agreement are quote unquote bad or like if it's like a loan shark, so to speak, and you take it, like, and you are forced to pay the thing, and you obviously end up quote unquote poorer than you started, and the other person ends up richer than you started, and then you assume all things like Matthew effects and all sort of runaway growth and so forth of two different piles of money. I think again you have why do people go into debt to begin with? And why do people finance and save or invest or or go into debt to invest, so to speak, which is a sort of absurdist thing, but it happens, which is basically what you do. And you're all right, the financial system is overly complex, but it's overly complex somewhat because people want it to be that way to make it harder for, other classes to use, which, again, why do they do that in the first place? Well, for maybe of reasons of malice to begin with. So that would be my response. I think you have to give the question, why do people take out worse terms than they otherwise could? Or why do people not, like Trump, and I know it was ghostwritten, but Trump wrote a book called The Art of Deal. And it is the case that clean capitalism involves trucking and bartering to a large extent. You have to, as either individuals, families, or firms. And you have to ask questions, well, why do some individuals, families, and firms do better at this game, even if you assume the rules are clean, not the rules in the current existing system, but if you assume the clean rules. And as Hans Hoppe would point out in his Austrian Marxist, or What Marx Gets Right, Marx starts from clean cap. Even if all the things that they complained about got done away with, they had the free market start, they would still think exploitation would happen, because ultimately they don't. I'm not sure if they admit this, but ultimately they think that, like why does a worker take a salary from a firm to begin with here? Because you really think that you're really calling that wage slavery here. You're not getting your full quote unquote shake, so to speak. But then what is your full shake other than, price plus demand or something like that? So yes, the financial system is crooked, but it was crooked to some extent before the gold standard too. I mean, there, like periodically during wars, like FDR stole all Americans' golds and put them in Fort Knox. #audit Fort Knox. But you have to then play that game, and it's a multi-generational game too. Fred Trump and the Kennedy father didn't do it because they wanted to help. They might have indirectly wanted to help the earth, but they wanted to make their children well off. They wanted to make their family name well off. They didn't do it. Now you could say, well, that's the wrong motivation. Well, I mean, this just goes back to the human nature question here, which some left libertarians dislike talking about. But it seems like people who are wealthy are doing it because they want to make their kids wealthy, or themselves. They want to enjoy the privileges of wealth and so forth. So that'd be my yes, the financial system is entirely crooked, but keep in mind, this is after 100 years of progressivisms being in power, of Keynesians being in power, and they all claim to help the poor, or at least on the surface level. So I will just state that, even if you have a clean market, you still have to play the game, and some people will do better than others. You multiply that over time. I do think large fortunes could be acquired, and if you don't have, rapacious states to steal the wealth away, after the Russian Revolution, it is and after the fall of Germany in 1945, it is a case that there was a sort of outside shock. States do work in breaking up mega corporations. The market in the 1800s was probably more freed, but Standard Oil did to some extent exist. And Carson himself is very critical of these regulatory agencies and so forth. But there were monopolies that were broken up in the statist paradigm. I mean, it might not be to the likings of left libertarians, but it does happen. So that would be another area where I think you have to think about debiting and crediting the accounts on both sides, not just one direction here. So family empires do exist. They might take a lot longer to acquire, but once they're acquired, if you have clean capitalists and sound rules and sound money, they're a lot harder to do away with in that regard. That would be my response to you with it. I mean, this is a great episode. Very interesting conversation. We're approaching the hour here, but that would be my pushback. I think this is our biggest disagreement here regarding is the financial system.
I think you might slightly misunderstand my point. I wasn't saying that it was bad for the little people as such. Well, I did indirectly, but not insofar as they use the banking services, just that how it alters prices of values of assets. Your Cantillon effect one is well taken. It is probably it is the case that because the dollar and pound are substantially above the purchasing power parity exchange rates. So an easy example. So the pound, the exchange rate from the pound to the Nigerian naira is about £1 equals 1,000 naira. And in the UK, you can buy a Coke can for about £1. In Nigeria, they're 250 naira. So effectively, I can exchange £1, which would buy one Coke can, to 4 Coke cans in Nigeria. That is not something you would typically expect, because you'd think, well, hang on, people would just sell pounds and buy naira and buy more Coke cans, which would increase the value of naira. But they don't. Why? Because there's lots of asset demand in the UK and the US. And what's the big asset demand, particularly in the US, is US Treasury debt. Now, why do people buy that? Well, you could argue, well, because of the US military, because they'll get upset if you don't buy their debt, and then they have to. So there is the interrelationship with that, but I don't want to go down there particularly. So Cantillon effects are well taken. Even if you did, though, just think of America as a closed society, or UK or England as a closed society, the disparity in wealth inequality would be substantially less. And also, you wouldn't be taking resources from people who receive the money last to the people who received it first, unless you have this inflationary system, which clearly, and I think, and obviously benefits the first receivers. And in the absence of this, I think you're likely to get much less income inequality. Now, of course, you could say, well, it could still exist. And I think, yes, it would. The question is by how much? I suppose the pushback might be, well, if you look, say, at the 19th century, income inequality was even higher. That may well be true. But again, my point is ceteris paribus one, and we need to look at the other things. And so, yes, I mean, in a more freed market, I suppose the left libertarian, I mean, an unfair characterization of him is, well, unless we get utopia, then we're going to get loads of income inequality. What we just need is that last regulation to be slashed, and then utopia will exist. And you could say, well, that's somewhat unlikely. Wouldn't you expect to tend towards utopia to the extent you remove regulations? Now, that may well be true, but in the question of which ones, and then you get to the question of, what was it Rothbard referred to as any orderism or something? Doesn't matter what we cut, we just cut anything because it's the state, and we're going to cut back the state. And to which his response is, well, that's probably not true. But then the problem is, well, which ones, and then how can you ever be proven wrong in that? So I take the Cantillon effects, but to me, it seems obvious, and my understanding of how the money and banking system works is whoever gets it first wins, and this allows massive increase in asset valuations and stuff. Now, you are right, historically, golf course lands, that's true. No doubt about that. My point is, if they stayed on it, then they would have been more equal. As I say, historically, you would have had less wars if they would have stayed on the gold standard, because you wouldn't have been able to afford the Napoleonic War. Well, England, that is, which killed lots of men and made lots of people quite rich. So leaving war as a way of making lots of money, #Ukraine, at this point. So that'd be my response. Do you have any final comments on that, or anything else to do with what we've done today?
My quick 1 minute comment here would be, I think the issue with Kevin Carson is that, and socialists and Marxists in general, is how do you get to the better society where there isn't this kind of either power elites with these bad values, or the systems which allow the power elites to exist to rape the little guy. You said you didn't necessarily mean the little guy, but the premise of Kevin Carson is the little guy would be better off, ceteris paribus. I mean, that is the premise. The little guy would be better off if he got rid of these things and so forth. How do you quote unquote get there? And then how do this unequal system or privilege system that privileges certain people get set up in the first place? And if you can understand how it got set up in the first place, I think you have to think about, why did the Dutch in 1600 start, or the Spanish in 1400 start acquiring colonies, and why didn't the Ottoman Empire do that? Or, well, actually they were, but the North Africans, so to speak. the Spanish actually just got out underneath the North Africans. So I think you have to answer these questions. And you could say, well, that's all luck, to some extent luck. And if you want to go to the war category, again, I just think this is to some extent a dead end on both an intellectual level and a practical level. If you want to say that great fortunes come about because of wars, I just think you just throw your hands up and just become a general social pessimist. You're not going to get a left libertarian paradise. You're not going to get a right libertarian paradise. You're going to get either some sort of crackpot socialism in one country scheme run by, a military dictatorship, which or you're going to get, neoliberalism, what they call despairingly neoliberalism, which has woke capitalists talking about, while they fly on their jets. I mean, I think you just general social pessimism is the answer. If you're going to say that great fortunes are only made by military things, then maybe you should just be like a primitivist and think what we really need to do is do away with power in general. Industrialism creates wealth inequality. It's not because in the ancient world you had small fortunes, but there is a way in which the fortunes we see now are on orders of magnitude bigger. But also the working classes and middle classes, my parents have a nicer home than Thomas Jefferson. Monticello is, by the way, go visit Monticello. It's in Virginia. It's a beautiful house, but it's very small. I mean, Jefferson was one of the richest people in time in the 1700s. So this is the Adam Smith question of wealth of nations. What allowed, the middle class to build these? Again, in the third world would just say, it's just colonialism and stuff like that. I don't know. I mean, I just think there's certain things that Marxists and socialists say which are just dead ends. And if there are dead ends, then you just have to be a social pessimist, which McIntyre is right about this. Marxism is deeply optimistic about human abilities and to organize. So, but I think you have to sort of recognize the challenge you're facing to do away with the state. Which and I'm somewhat rambling here, but I'm just if you want to say all the wealth come from wars, I just if you want to acquire wealth, then do you have to go to war? I mean, we've had some debates with Todd Lewis regarding neoconservatism and empires and so forth. And I mean, he privately is a pacifist. But publicly, he seems to be on the camp of Alan Dulles. We need to have lots of aircraft and Peter Zehan, lots of aircraft carriers and so forth, so we can back up the banks, so we can back up American power, so we can keep the sea lanes open. So what Kevin Carson should really do is become a primitivist, in my opinion. If you really want equality, what you really need is a kind of primitivism. But if you go back to primitive societies, they have eternal inequalities too, the ones we can anthropologically study. I mean, they're not as large, but they do still exist. So that'd be my final response. I might be rambling here, Swithin, but thanks. I thought this was a great talk. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I think this has been pretty good as well. I would say that it's not obvious. It's hard to say whether the little guy would be better off financially. I do, though, think, and a point Sean Gabber's made before is, in a freed market, it is likely that the little guy might have more choice over what he does. And so even though he may not earn a huge amount, he won't be dictated to by the local mega corporation. So even though he might not earn that much in his small firm that he works for, he may be treated better and have more, be happier because he has more control over it. Now, whether that would be true or not is another question, but I think that's a defensible position given the lower barriers to entry in the market. So I think that's the case. So my point more narrowly would be that I don't think the rich would be quite as rich. Whether the little guy be that much better, that depends who exploits whom. Question, really. But that would be, I think, interesting. And no, I'm not saying wars are the only way of making money. My comment was merely that the reason they went off the gold standard was that so that the government can get better finance for war. That's all. So yeah, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.